The gospel text of today is taken from the Gospel of Mark chapter 4, verses 35 to 41, and is summarized in this title, The Storm on the Lake. Before this encounter which the disciples had with the sea, Jesus has told 3 parables. And in each of these parables, he has given a lesson of hope. He has given a lesson where the disciples must not give in to despair. He has given a lesson where the disciples realize or must realize that God continues to be with them even when they cannot see or experience God's presence. After telling these parables, after explaining one of the 3 parables in detail to the disciples, Jesus invites them to move away now from the crowd so that they can have time by themselves. And so they set out in a boat. The boat in which the disciples were could accommodate around 15 persons, and so they would have been the disciples and maybe others along with Jesus. And the first thing that Jesus does when he enters the boat is he goes to the stern, puts his head on a cement bag possibly, and he goes to sleep. The reason why Jesus goes to sleep on the surface level would be because he was tired. He has been talking, he has been teaching, he has been explaining, he has been with the crowds, and now he also needs his rest. So on the surface level, Jesus is physically tired, is mentally tired, and so needs that rest, and so is asleep. But on the deeper level, the sleep of Jesus is much more than physical tiredness. It is his confidence in God. It is his trust in God. It is his faith that God would see him through. And even as the journey begins, there are waves which lash into the boat. And even though it would have been a fairly large boat, the waves were lashing and entering into the boat. Possibly some of the water from the waves would have splashed on Jesus, and yet we are not told that he awoke. Because Mark wants to indicate to us not only that Jesus was in a very, very deep sleep where even this water splashing possibly on his face would have not awakened him, he also wants to tell us about his deep and profound trust in God. The disciples have heard the parables. The disciples have been taught about the parables, and yet the disciples have understood nothing. They've understood nothing because their response is that they are awake. But their wakefulness is not wakefulness in the true sense of the word. It is a wakefulness which leads to agitation. It is a wakefulness which leads to anxiety. It is a wakefulness which leads to worry. And in this anxiety and worry, and in this tension, they rush to Jesus and make an allegation. They accuse Jesus of an attitude which shows that he does not care. When they say to him, Master, do you not care? We are perishing. They address Jesus as Master, as they ought to do. But the next 2 phrases indicate their own response to the storm. Do you not care? We have been through and are going through this COVID-19 pandemic. The vaccine has come, and yet we are not really sure of the efficacy of the vaccine. And during this 1.5 years almost now, we so often, like the disciples, have thrown up our hands in despair, have looked to the heavens and have accused God of a non-caring attitude. Not only that, the next phrase also communicates the attitude of the disciples and our own attitude, at least the attitude of some of us. We are perishing. We are being destroyed. We are being annihilated. That is what we keep telling God. The disciples said that to Jesus, and Jesus wakes up now. And the first thing that Jesus does is he calms the storm with a word. We wonder, why has God not eradicated this COVID-19 pandemic? God has given us the ability to do so. Because God is not a rescuer. If God was a rescuer, God would come to our aid every time we needed help. We would remain children, and God wants us to grow. That's why God will give us indications. That's why God will give us pointers. That's why God will give us the grace to do what we have to do. But we need to be open to that grace. In the case of the storm on the lake, Jesus calms the storm with a word, and then he turns to the disciples and their allegation and their accusation and says to them, why did you doubt? Have you no faith? The word faith means that we are not able to see sometimes. The word faith means that we cannot see sometimes. The word faith means that we believe not after we see, but that we believe before we see. Our job is not to get agitated, because even in our wakefulness during this pandemic, like the disciples, it is likely that we are agitated and we are anxious and we are worried and we are tense. If our wakefulness is leading us to these negatives, it is a wasted wakefulness, like the wakefulness of the disciples. It is better then for us to be serene like Jesus. And so, we have got two responses that we can give. One response is the response of the disciples. And the response of the disciples is to give in to agitation, to give in to tension and anxiety, to make allegations, to make accusations, to be negative and to respond to life and the situation in a negative way. Another response is the response of Jesus, to be positive, to realize that yes, there is a storm, to realize that this may not be the only storm in our lives and that there will be many other storms which will come our way. And yet, in all of these storms, God, because God is a God of love, will say to the wind and the waves, be still. And then he'll turn to us and say, why are you afraid? Have you no faith? Faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. There are 4 words here in this definition of faith from the letter to the Hebrews, where we are told it is assurance. To be assured of something means to be sure, to be definite, to be convinced that it will happen. And our assurance, the second word, is what we hope for. We hope for a better today. We hope for a today where we will not look in only on ourselves, but we will be convinced and concerned about others as well. Our hope is for a day when every single person in our universe will have the basic necessities of life, where every single person will go to bed at night with a stomach that is at least half full. That every person in this universe will have clothes on his or her back and a place to live in. This is what we must hope for. Often, our hopes are too selfish and too self-centered, focused only on ourselves. Can my hope be focused on others outside of me? The third word in this definition is the conviction. To be convinced about something is to know for a fact that it is true, and the conviction is about things unseen. It is easy to be convinced about things that we see. It is easy to be convinced about things of which there are scientific proofs, but in many cases, there will be no scientific proofs, like in the present situation in which we find ourselves, and yet because our God can calm the storms, because our God with a word can make things well, we are convinced that even though we may not always see, we will still believe. Have you, during this time, accused God of a non-caring attitude? Have you, during this time, thought that you were perishing and being destroyed? Will you take on the attitude of Jesus and remain serene, remain calm, be concerned about others, so that you will be convinced that this storm will be controlled, that this storm will